Thanks for joining me today. We're going to tie up a wonderful classic bucktail streamer pattern called the Blacknose Dace. Art Flick came up with this pattern many years ago to resemble the actual Blacknose Dace that's in many streams all across the U.S. It's a great little pattern. It's very durable. It's a great fishing fly. We tie this in many different sizes for different seasons, different water conditions, and for different species. It's a basic fly to tie, very simple, not much in the way of the materials on it. One thing that I'm going to include in this particular pattern, which I haven't seen on many of them that have been tied, is the oval tinsel rib. Many people, for some reason, omit that. I think it's a necessary piece because I think it adds a little bit of segmentation and a little bit of flash to the fly. So we're going to go ahead and include that. And there will be a little bit more information as we go through the video about the history on this fly and how it's tied and how it's put together. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll get started tying our Blacknose Dace by putting our hook in the vise. You can debarb the hook if you want. At this point, I'm going to start tying this by using just a flat wax nylon. It's a bigger denier, and the reason is, as I'm tying in this yarn, I want a bigger denier to get from one end to the other end a little bit quicker. Then we'll change up to a smaller diameter thread when we finish up the fly. You could use, say, a Danville Fly Masters Plus, or even a Wapsi 210 UTC or something like that. I'm going to attach the thread about an eye length behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to advance my thread all the way down the hook shank to the point of the hook. So I have that in place. I'm going to tie my yarn in. This is just a regular old nondescript red yarn. This is a 3-strand red yarn. This is also a 9674 Mustad number 4 hook, and the Blacknose Dace is usually tied in anything from a size 2 down to a size 10. On a size 2 or 4, I'm going to use all 3 strands of this yarn. If I'm going to tie this on a size 6 or a size 8, I would probably just use 2 strands. And when I get down to size 10, it's small enough, I would just use 1 strand of this yarn. I'm going to tie this in with just a little bit overhanging the eye of the hook, and you'll see why in just a moment. I'm going to anchor this in right here with a few nice tight wraps. And now I'm going to tie in my rib. The rib that I'm using is just an oval silver tinsel. I'm going to tie this in the length of the body, so I want this end of it to be just about the length of the body. I'm going to tie it on my side of the hook, and I'm going to keep wrapping down the hook shank, securing that in. I'm going to wrap till I get all the way down the end of the shank, which is just about over the barb of the hook, and then I'm going to start wrapping back up. I don't have to worry about them being touching turns all up the hook shank right here. It does make it a little bit nicer, but the way we're going to tie our body in, which is a Mylar silver Mylar Tinsel, it will cover up anything, so if we have any gaps of thread. When you are wrapping this forward, you can spin your thread counterclockwise if you want to flatten it out a little bit. You do want to watch your tension as you're coming up forward, because as you're wrapping that, you're going to compress that yarn. You want to make certain that you're keeping that tension the same so that that body ends up being nice and uniform. We don't have any dips in it and any rises on it. You also don't want that yarn to twist around the hook shank as you're wrapping this down. I'm going to get about 80% up the hook shank here and trim off the excess yarn here. The reason why I left it a little bit long is so that I can have a little handle to hold here with my left hand. I'm going to bring my scissors in and cut this at an angle. The base of that angle is going to be right behind the eye of the hook. You'll see in just a moment when I wrap this down, this gives me a nice uniform body all the way up to the end of the body, and then tapers down quickly in the head region of the fly. Now, again, I was using the flat wax nylon just to be able to wrap this in a little bit quicker. I'm going to go ahead and change over to, this is a Wapsi 70 Denier UTC. You could use a Danville 6/0 if you want. I'm going to go ahead and attach that right behind the eye of the hook here and wrap backwards down the hook shank just to the very end of the body. So I'm just up at the top of this rise right here. Then I can cut both the tag end and the flat wax nylon thread off. I don't need those anymore. At this point, I'm going to tie in my body, which is the Mylar Tinsel. I'm going to tie it on my side with the gold side, this side right here, up facing me. There's different ways you can tie this in, and you don't have to do this fly in a double layer. You can certainly do it in a single layer. I just like the double layer better. It's a nicer look. So I'm just going to anchor that right in here, making certain that I'm not wrapping too much down the hook shank here. I want to stay right in the area where the head's going to be. At this point, I'm going to take a little super glue, and I'm just going to put a thin layer of super glue right along the hook shank and those threads. This is just going to reinforce it a little bit and help it when we're fishing this fly. I'll start wrapping this in. You'll notice it flips over to the silver side. I want to try and get touching turns as I'm wrapping this down the hook shank. It's not imperative that I get touching turns. I don't want to overlap because that would translate into the second layer of Mylar. So I would rather have just a few little possible hairline gaps there where the thread's showing through, and this is part of the reason I like using the double tinsel method, because when I come back forward, that second layer is going to cover up any of those layers, I should say any of those gaps down below, and it'll be a nice uniform tinsel body. Just take your time with it. When you get back up here to where your thread's at, just tie that in. A few wraps to secure it. We'll cut away the excess. Now I'm going to wrap that end down a little bit as I move down the head, and I'm going to get about halfway into the head space here, just a little bit behind the eye of the hook. At this point, I'm going to wrap in my oval tinsel. I have one wrap right around the back, and then I'm going to open up and put in anywhere from about 6 to 8 wraps. The important thing here is when you're tying this in, this last wrap has to come just a little bit behind the head space, but come underneath the hook shank so that it is anchored in right underneath the hook shank. The reason for that is that if it is too close in the head space right here, it will tend to cause the bucktail to flare up straight up in the air. And if it's right up here, it's going to make it difficult for us to tie in that bucktail. So I want to bring that last wrap up close to behind the head space right here where we're going to tie in our bucktail, and then secure it on the bottom side. Cut away the excess, and then I'm going to wrap that cutaway piece down, and I'm going to put some extra wraps right in here behind the eye of the hook, just tidying this up a little bit and making it nice and smooth and level for tying in our bucktail wing. At this point, I can go ahead and cut off the yarn off the back end here. When I cut this off, I want to have the end of it just even with the bend of the hook. You want this just to be a very, very short little tag of red yarn. You can take your bodkin or a comb or something like that, fluff that out, and actually you could even just leave that your first cast or two in the water, and that's all going to separate for you just fine. Now at this point we're ready for our bucktail. The wing on the Blacknose Dace is tied with some white bucktail under a brown or under a black bucktail, and then under a brown bucktail. So there's 3 different colors. Originally, when Art Flick created this fly, he actually used polar bear hair as the white instead of a white bucktail. He liked it because it was softer than the bucktail. Bucktail can tend to be kind of stiff. And then for the black, instead of using a black bucktail, he actually used black bear hair. Or you can substitute some black hair from a skunk's tail. Since polar bear you can't get anymore, and skunk is a little bit harder to get, I'm just going to stick with bucktail on this. So I've already cut some bucktail out and stacked it. You don't have to have this stacked just perfect. Matter of fact, the ends right here, if they are not 100% aligned, that's fine. What you're looking for is something fairly close, but you don't want it quite as ragged as what you might cut off, off of the directly off the bucktail. I'm going to measure these. I want the tips to come just a little bit past the red tag, the tail back here, maybe about the same length as the red tag, and I'm going to cut the excess off. I'm going to tie these in just right here in the middle of the head. I want to make certain those butt ends are getting down to just behind the eye of the hook. If we have them too far back, we're going to end up with a little bit of a squared off head, and I want to try and have it a little bit smoother. At this point, you'll notice the bucktail seems to be kind of jutting up at an angle. That's fine. As we tie in the other bucktails, that will start to push that down a little bit. The next bucktail we're going to tie in is some black bucktail. Now, the one thing you want to be careful of, a lot of people when they tie bucktail streamers like this that have multiple different colors of bucktail and everything, they clip out almost enough hair to make the entire wing. And then they have 3 clumps to put in. So they end up with a real bushy wing. You want to remember that you're looking for something that's just going to suggest the different colors of this bait fish. So the black that I have here is a little thicker than I want. And that's fine. I find it easier to cut out more than I want and prep it, and then you can always just take a little bit out. So I'm going to make the black bucktail segment just a little bit thinner, and I also want it shorter. A lot of people will tie that in the same, all of these the same length. Art Flick originally, when he created this pattern, liked to tie these with the black bucktail a little bit shorter. And I kind of like that because I think when it's in the water, the black is to mimic the lateral line on the fish. Well, the lateral line will go back to the tail, but the white and the dark of the minnow will actually taper down by the tail as well. So cut the excess off after I measure that, and I'll tie that in just like I did the white. I want the butt ends to come up just up behind the eye of the hook. You'll notice each time I'm tying this in, I'm putting a few extra wraps of thread to kind of smooth the whole head off so that the next clump of bucktail has a nice smooth area to be tied into. Now for the last bit of bucktail that we're going to tie in for our wing, you could use a regular brown bucktail, but most of your brown dyed bucktail tends to be a darker brown. But what I prefer to do is actually use the bleached out hairs on the back of the bucktail. Normally this portion of the bucktail isn't really used for much. It's generally just kind of discarded once you've gotten all of the hairs that are considered usable off the bucktail. This is just thrown away. But for this particular pattern, I like to go ahead and cut these out because I like it. It's not a very dark brown. It's just kind of it's pronounced enough, but it's a lighter brown. The other thing is these hairs tend to be softer than the regular bucktails on here, so it gives you a little bit softer top to your wing. Once again, you cut that out and you stack it. It is not important to have all of those be perfectly even. You're going to want to put this in so that the tips of the brown are about as the same length as the tips of the white. So if I were to push that down a little bit, you'll see that the brown is the same as the white, and the black actually is a little bit shorter. Cut the excess off, and I'm going to tie that in the same way. I'm going to pull these back just a little bit from the eye of the hook so that when I finish the head here, I don't have as much of a pronounced drop right here. Hopefully I get a little bit more of a slope. It's a little bit too close, so I'm going to tie this in again. Just take your time. Remember, you're in no hurry here. If you tie something in and you don't quite like its position or how it's on the hook, say it's cantered a little bit up here or just not right, just unwrap and do it again. So at this point, the wing is all done. I'm going to secure that in and move up to the head of the fly and start making the actual head. Head on this is, and most of your bucktail streamers have a larger, more pronounced head, simply because you have such a large wing and that bucktail is so bulky. Two things you want to be careful of is the length of the overall head as well as the width of the head, or I should say the height of the head. Just put in enough thread wraps to cover everything up and get the head the size, shape that you want. And then we'll go ahead and put in a 4 or 5 turn whip finish. We can cut our thread off. Often people who are tying the Blacknose Dace will actually paint eyes on the sides because the head has such a wide profile here. So you could put a white dot on there and then a small black dot in the center to make an eye on the Blacknose Dace if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and put some head cement on this. Initially I'm using just a fly-tight head cement because it's a thin head cement and it will soak right in. Once that is cured or dried, I'm going to go ahead and use some Hard as Hull, and I'm going to put 3 coats of Hard as Hull on this to give it a nice lacquered finish. So I'm going to let that dry, and then I will show you each of the different coats of Hard as Hull so that you can see its progress to where we get a really, really nice lacquered head on that. So our Blacknose Dace here, the head has just the one coating of fly tight on there just to solidify all that thread in there. You could certainly fish this fly just the way it is right now. You don't have to put the next steps in, but they do look awfully nice when you put a lacquered type finish on the end. I'm using a product here called Hard as Hull, and it is just a clear gloss finish. You could use a black lacquer. I'm just going to use this because the black threads will show. It will take 3 coats to get this into a nice smooth lacquered head. I'm going to put the first one on here and let that dry. And one thing you'll notice is when I come back to put the second coat on, you'll actually see how this shrinks down around the thread wraps. It looks like it's finished right now. It's all nice and smooth and glossy and thick, but that will shrink down as it cures and down, and the thread will actually show in there. So our Blacknose Dace has been sitting there for about 5 minutes while that first coat of hard as hull has dried. You'll notice that it has shrunk away and you can actually see the gloss coat starting to form, but you can still see the thread wraps and all the bumps in there. So it isn't nice and smooth yet. Now I'm going to put another coat of gloss coat on here, and each one is generally just thick enough so that it's not dripping, but it just is coating the head. We don't want it so thick that it's going to be dripping off. Also, each coat that you put on here is going to take longer and longer to cure. First one only takes a few minutes. Second one usually takes about 10 minutes or so. The last one's going to take about 20 minutes to fully cure. If you do put too much on there in one coat, you can wipe the brush off in the jar of hard as hull and you can get some of that extra cement off of there before you just let it dry. If you're going to be tying up a bunch of flies like this, the Blacknose Dace or any other bucktail streamers, that even wet flies that you want to put a nice glossed head on, I would recommend that you tie all of them to the point where you just get your initial head cement on there to secure the threads, and then stage them so that you can, each one you can get one coat of hard as hull, another coat, and another coat as you're doing all the flies at the same time so you don't kind of lose track. So we'll let this one sit here for another 10 minutes or so, and we'll come back and get the last coat on there. So our second coat of hard as hull has been curing on this for the last 10 minutes or so, and as you can see, it looks closer. This side right here is pretty smooth, but then you come around the top and the other side and you can see this thread wraps again. So we still have a little bit more to go. We're going to put our third coat on here. I generally try to make this a little bit thinner coat. We're going to put our third coat on here, and this will smooth everything off. Occasionally I have to put a fourth coat on if for some reason I put it on a little bit too thin. If I'm using a heavier thread, such as a Flymasters Plus or a 210, sometimes it takes a fourth coat simply to fill in all the gaps around that thread a little bit more. Take your time with it, fill in those spots, get it all nice and even and fairly smooth. Because this is going to take a little bit longer to fully cure, it will level itself out to a certain extent. Another reason for having it on a rotary vise, it's kind of nice because you can let it sit in different areas to level itself out, let gravity help you out a little bit there. As you can see, it's all pretty nice and smooth. We'll come back in another 20 minutes and we'll take a look at it as it is fully cured, and then see if we need another coat. Probably not, but we'll be right back. So the third coat's cured on our Blacknose Dace, and as you can see, as I rotate this around, it's pretty darn smooth. You could potentially put another coat on there, but then you're kind of getting the head even a little bit thicker. For me, that's more than smooth enough. You don't see any of the thread wraps and the bumps in the thread, things like that translating through the head. And that's really what you're looking for. Now, if I had some eyes painted on the side of that, you know, I might need another coat just to smooth that off, help protect those painted eyes a little bit. But I think that that is pretty darn good, and it's done. So that's a Blacknose Dace. Fairly simple pattern to tie. It does take a little bit of time because of the bucktail, the three different colors of bucktail you got to put in there and stack and everything. But it's a fun pattern. It's a great fishing fly. So you want to take this out and actually fish it, and you catch all kinds of different smallmouth trout, largemouth bass, different lots of different species will go after this fly. Again, you can tie this anywhere from about a size 2 on down to a size 10. The larger sizes tend to do well in a little bit darker water in the spring and summertime, and the smaller sizes do pretty well in the fall when the water's a little bit clearer. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the content that I create here at Dressed Irons, feel free to hit that subscribe button down below. Hit the thumbs up if you like this particular video, and please share them with anyone who you think might be interested in any of the videos that I produce. Hit the notification icon down there at the bottom, and you'll get notified once a week when I put out new videos. As always, if you have any questions about this fly or any of the flies that I've tied, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below. I'll answer any questions that you have. And until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong.